Kyle Mohan Racing, KMR. I've got this Turbo 2 4-port street port project laid out in front of me. I thought this would be a great time to talk a little rotary, do a little info talk, tech talk on why I like street ports, why I like the street port 4-port turbo motors, and a little bit of why I think it's a good idea and some technical information into what's going on. So this is not a completed port job. This is just kind of the rough cut. So there will be more polishing going on, but you can see how the shape has been enlarged and ramped. And if you come over here and see what the stock port looked like, it was rough, not nearly as ramped towards that extended duration of the port. So you're not going to get as much volume or duration in that stock configuration. And I grabbed one of my KMR Bridgeport templates just to kind of lay over it because it's got a nice street port. And you can see if you take one of these traditional turbo 4-port engines, and this could go for the Turbo 2, the third generation RX-7 FD3S blocks, and Cosmo blocks, including 13B and 20Bs, all of them had I wouldn't call it restrictive, but a port size that could be opened up pretty easily, and you could pick up, 15% volumetric flow, something in that range, depending on the boost numbers you're running. And guess what? That really increases your horsepower. And with rotary motors, something that comes up a lot is I'll hear people, hey, Kyle, doesn't street porting, like bridge porting, like semi-peripheral porting, doesn't that hurt your bottom end? What if I want a really easy to drive car? Well, that's in reality what the street port's all about. When you do a bridge port or a semi-peripheral or a peripheral, generally I wouldn't expect that car to really pick up any power until you're well into the 5,000 plus RPM range. But with street ports, and this would be fairly across the board for street ports, even though we're talking about turbo 4-port street ports here, you're not going to lose that much on your very bottom end. And then you're going to either stay very close to or slightly above on your mid-range of what that OEM flow was. And on the top end, you're really going to pick up some flow. You're going to pick up horsepower. You're going to utilize that RPM that a rotary motor has. And rotary motors aren't torque monsters. So what they are is RPM monsters. And so as you get into the higher RPM with higher horsepower, subsequently you're making more torque. And a few people always say, well, I want good bottom end. And well, my response would be is I don't drive rotaries in low RPM. Generally, if you're taking a rotary motor up close to its red line, by the time you bring it back into its shift point, any street port, whether it be RX-7 or RX-8, 12A, 13B, drops you down into an RPM range from where you shift out of a gear and into the next gear back into a RPM range where you can climb back through the power band. So generally, street ports do not drop you out of your power band with an OEM gearbox or an OEM rear end, which semi-peripherals, bridge ports, some of those can actually, depending on what RPM you are shifting at and back into, drop you out of your RPM band range. So, to answer those questions, no, I don't worry about the little bit of low RPM loss because I'm so excited about all of the mid-range and high RPM gains that I can have. And that's where I actually drive rotaries at for performance. Now, if you think back to what rotary trucks had really small ports, smaller than those. And that was a port that was meant for low RPM driving and torque. But those motors didn't rev high, they didn't make a lot of horsepower, so you're always going to have trade-offs. With your turbo 4-port motors, if you notice, there is what I consider the secondary ports, which are your two outside housings or your outside plates, and then you've got your primary ports up the middle, which also have your primary injectors housed in them. You don't want to go too excessively big, but I also don't see a lot of value in leaving the primary ports too small. I think some people do just polish the primary ports, but at Mazda Tricks, we saw some pretty big gains without hurting our bottom end very much by enlarging our primary ports as well as our secondary ports. Some things to consider: although you can use a street port like this with an OEM computer, I always recommend that when you're doing any type of aggressive modifications, it's always good to make sure your tune is safe, because subsequently, like third gens and sometimes second gens, if you did a nice street port and you have a very open flowing exhaust and you have a very open flowing intake on a stock computer, and maybe your injectors aren't in perfect condition, it is a possibility that you can exceed the stock computer's ability to deliver fuel and keep the motor within its safe running fuel mixture and timing conditions. So I think a lot of what happened with rotaries and some of what people consider unreliable is it was really a case of modifications getting beyond what the OEM computer could do. However, I do know street ports like this and second gens and third gens do work well with the stock computer, and in some cases even pass smog, just depending on if you're opening up your intake, as far as your intake timing very much versus your duration, which that intake timing does give you overlap. But these are all things to consider when you're doing rotary modifications. And again, coming back to the street port, it's one of my favorite ports because of all of these things. It can pass smog, depending on where you're at and how aggressive you go. It does retain great mid-range horsepower, torque. It doesn't put you outside of your RPM shift points. Meaning if you come up to red line and then you drop down into the next gear, you should still be in a great power band with almost any street port configuration, turbo, naturally aspirated, with an OEM RX-8 or RX-7 gearbox. So these are really nice things. It also doesn't do anything that would cause any type of subsequent issues with long-term reliability. It's not like bridge porting that cuts into the water seals, or peripheral porting where you're sometimes having to use epoxies. This maintains all of your OEM seal points, no modifications to the water seals. It's not going to cause any harm. In actuality, I think a good street port on your intake side with a good street port on your exhaust side, depending on your configuration, could actually help the motor last longer, because you're just helping it flow that air both in and out more efficiently. So if you're not adding more boost, or you're not trying to get more horsepower per se, you're just trying to clean things up, a little bit of a street port on both ends can help things out, because you're going to get rid of some of this casting slag and roughness. And generally speaking, once these are done, we don't go super fine polish, because that can cause fuel to stick to the ports. But when you're done, you'll have a semi-smooth polish, allowing the air to tumble and the fuel to stay atomized as it flows into the combustion pockets. On the exhaust side, we generally do go more polished, because you're not worried about that fuel atomization. So, I don't know, comment below. I like street ports. I mean, I've done bridge ports, I've done semi-Ps, I've had them, all those configurations in my cars. I'm not hating on any of them. I'm just here talking about them, and if people have questions, feel free to comment below. I'll do my best to answer those questions, either in upcoming videos or just in the comments. And we're just having fun on this rotary-filled channel. We've got the Formula Drift season coming up soon. I run a street port similar to this in my 20B, which makes roughly 1,000 horsepower at 33 pounds of boost with a 200 shot of nitrous. So street ports can make horsepower. It just all depends on your configuration, how you want the motor to sound, what you want to get out of it in life. That's what the brap's all about. And with that, I'm going to say it. I'm going to brap on out of here. We've talked about street ports a little. Hit me with those questions, and we'll see you next time. I think these housings, a little more polish, they're going on the lapping table. Go brap, brap, brap on out of here.